Welcome to Talk+Water, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Professor Manny Teodoro. Manny is a professor at the Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research stands at the nexus of politics, public policy, and public management. He works mainly on American environmental policy, design, evaluation, and implementation issues. His 2022 book, The Profits of Distrust, along with Samantha Zuhlke and David Switzer, links the meteoric rise of the commercial drinking water industry to distrust in government and a broader withdrawal from civic life. Manny, welcome and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Thanks, Todd. Good to be with you.
So always start out with, how people ended up thinking and working on water in their careers. And so why don't you tell us about your background in water and how you first became interested in it?
Yeah, I have to admit, I did not grow up as a small child playing on the playground and dreaming of analyzing water finance and regulatory regimes. But I have always been interested in the tangible elements of government, public policy, the way that governments affect our daily lives, for better or for worse. Back in college, I started off most interested in housing and transportation, and I've always been mostly interested in finance. I really got into water when I got a Truman Scholarship and went to Cornell to get an MPA, where my advisor was a guy named Dick Schuler. And he was an engineer and an economist, and he had formerly served on the New York State Public Services Commission. So studying with him really introduced me to the world of public utilities. When I graduated and moved back to Seattle, I started working for a public economics consulting firm where virtually all of my clients were local government water and sewer systems. Now, that stuff's pretty obscure if you're not working in the water sector, but once you get into it, man, water infrastructure, governance, finance, regulation is just fascinating. And more importantly, it touches so many lives in ways that just aren't always appreciated. So I feel like it's this area that's intellectually satisfying, but it also helps me feel like my work is not just esoteric ivory tower stuff. It's work that matters in people's real lives.
Well, it definitely does. And I can tell you my time at the River Authority I worked for 18 years, we had, one issue after another with the local communities and their water systems and wastewater systems. And so, that was always a real challenge for us. We were the regional entity, and we were operating in a period when everybody wanted to own their own systems. And there was a lot of, back and forth between one community saying, hey, we want to, buy this system that you built and you've been operating for us, and we're going to run it. And it made for a real challenge because a lot of times they do that and they wouldn't make the, investments in maintenance that had been made over the years. And then the system would get in trouble, and then the state regulator would step in and they'd call the River Authority and say, hey, you need to take this system back over again. And it was in bad shape. And at that point, it required a lot of money to get going again.
Yeah, the only thing that I can say that's happy about that story is at least the state regulator took some action. Unfortunately, right. You look across the country, sometimes neglect is the way that they address that problem. Look, it's not surprising that small communities feel a strong sense of ownership over these systems. There's sort of an intangible reason for that. Then there's a good, hard-headed, practical reason. The intangible thing is that water is intensely personal. It's right. Intimate in a way that nothing else that government does really is. I mean, we're talking about a government service that flows into your home 24 hours a day. You immerse your children in it. You cook with it. You take it into your body. We're talking about a government service that people ingest. So, of course, there's an intense kind of feeling of attachment to the water source. Then on a practical level, if we're honest about it, a lot of local governments treat their water systems like cash cows. They find clever ways, even though it's technically illegal. They find clever ways to channel water and sewer rate revenue away from those systems and into the city coffers. A lot of communities around the country tax their water systems. I don't know how prevalent that is in Texas. I don't think it is, but in a lot of states it is. And in Wisconsin, for example, somewhere on an average, about 15 to 17% of our water revenue goes to city taxes. In California, it's similar. In some parts of our state here in Wisconsin, it can be up to 50% of the water rate revenue is going to city taxes. And so there's a lot of financial incentives for those small communities to hang on to those systems in ways that ultimately are self-defeating and self-destructive and do not end up serving their customers well.
Well, I'm glad that you said that some of those communities treat their water systems as cash cows instead of meat. But that's what I was saying as well. And what was always interesting to me is for many of those cities, they had city councils that they were term limited, right? And so someone would say, hey, we're going to do this. They take that action. Well, then they were off the city council in a few years, right? And, the system would then start having trouble. And then the fix took years to do or to pay for. And so there was kind of this mismatch between short-term and long-term thinking and action. But your book, Profits of Distrust, in that book, you go deep into these issues with your research and found some things that surprised me a little bit, because I was thinking about what communities, do you really see, this issue where people are not trusting the water supplies and are turning to alternatives. And so why don't you talk a little bit about what you found?
Sure. Well, the Profits of Distrust, give you a little bit of background. That thing started as a very small, modest study of these commercial drinking water kiosks in the state of Texas. When I started writing that book, I was at Texas A&M University. I was on faculty there for 7 years, loved my time in Aggie land and in Texas. But that was a good example of what happens when you come as an outsider into a new place. I moved to Texas. I had never lived in Texas before. And I started seeing these Watermill Express kiosks all over the place. And I had never seen those before. I had come from part of the country where those aren't so prevalent. So I didn't know, what the heck are these things? I had a colleague at Texas A&M who liked to say that every good study starts with the phrase, what the heck? Although he didn't use the word heck. He used a different word in there. But the idea is you start with this puzzle, like, what is this thing? So I went, by happenstance, I happened to attend a lecture by a professor named Wendy Jepson, who was also at Texas A&M. And she gave a talk about these water kiosks along the Mexico border down in the Rio Grande Valley. And her argument was that people turn to these things because they live in areas that either don't have any potable water supply, or that their water utility service is so poor that they can't trust it, and they feel sort of disenfranchised from their local governments. And that really resonated with me. But then I asked myself, okay, that makes sense. That explains why these things are in the Rio Grande Valley, but it doesn't explain why they're in Houston. That doesn't explain why they're in Austin or San Antonio or Phoenix or Los Angeles or Atlanta and all kinds of other places that have excellent drinking water systems. So why are these things showing up in these cities where there isn't a water quality problem, there isn't an availability problem, and the water is actually relatively affordable, certainly compared to the 35 cents a gallon that they're paying at the kiosk? So I had a new grad student at that time, Samantha Zuhlke, who is now a professor at Iowa. She is a spatial econometrician and geographer. And so I said, all right, Sam, let's look into these things, try to figure out what's going on with these kiosks. And we thought maybe there were pockets of urban areas where there was no availability of water, or maybe there are people who are getting cut off from their service. Well, to make a long story short, the more we dug into it, the more we realized these kiosks were not a strictly economic phenomenon or physical phenomenon that had to do with availability of water. They were a social phenomenon. There was something interesting happening there because we found that they were in places that were in the middle of cities that had relatively low income, and they were predominantly non-white. So we're talking especially Hispanic communities and areas with large African American populations. At the same time, about the same time, we went to a conference where David Switzer, who's now at the University of Missouri, gave a talk about how people who distrust government are more likely to drink bottled water. And Sam and I looked at each other and said, I think he's onto something there.
Yeah.
And then the three of us got together, and later on there was this book. And so what we think happens is that people perceive tap water failures. Those failures can be immediate, like I see a problem with my water in my own experience, or I can see a news article about it. I can see something about the Flint water crisis, or Jackson, Mississippi, or any of the problems that in Texas folks know about the challenges in Corpus Christi. I hear news about that, and I think, that could be happening to my community. So that reduces my trust in my utility. That causes me to decide whether to use exit or voice. And that's a decision whether I should start choosing to drink a bottled water product, or I should go to my government and ask for a better service or better regulation. And oftentimes people will choose to exit for bottled water because they don't trust that the government will respond effectively to the challenge. That reduces, once I've exited and started drinking the commercial product, I have less incentive to engage with government. So I'm less likely to vote, I'm less likely to show up at a town meeting, less likely to contact my regulator or contact my legislator. And that reduces the incentives and the resources available for regulators and utilities to provide good service. And that, of course, leads to an erosion of service quality. And then we fall into this vicious cycle. And that's the central argument of the book. We sort of spend 200 pages plus walking through every stage of that cycle to demonstrate how it works.
Well, I can tell you that without naming names, somebody very close to me who I have had this discussion with many times about how good the water quality of our water out of our tap is a big proponent of bottled water. And I am, not to give too much information, but regularly I am having to lug these 24-pack, bottled waters out of the car into the house. Every time I do, I'm like, my dog is going to go out because of this, and this is, such a waste of money and all. But the folks who drink bottled water are, they're convinced that it's substantially better and healthier. And I'm guessing that given the explosion of, all the bottled water products that there are and the people who make them, that probably some of these companies are exploiting that, concern that people have about water and their government, and they're trying to get people to buy more bottled water, right? And so they're maybe kind of pushing this narrative a little. Have you seen kind of overt examples of that?
Yes, no question. I mean, the title of our book is The Profits of Distrust. And those profits are going to commercial water companies. And by that, I mean the kiosks like the Watermill Express on the street corner, or the Primo kiosks in the supermarket, or certainly the cases of bottled water that people are lugging out of the Walmart or the Costco or whatever. And there's no question that distrust of municipal tap water is key to at least a significant portion of the success of the bottled water industry. And even though when they're making public declarations about it, the bottled water companies will always be very careful to say, "Oh, we do not see municipal water as a competitor." The truth is that they do. One of the things that happened that we ran across as we were developing the book is we found some filings, 10K filings with the SEC, in which bottled water companies are coming right out and telling their investors that our growth opportunity is distrust in municipal tap water. That's what they're telling their investors.
Hey, well,
right?
I guess you have to say it's great they're honest. I mean, they're
they're honest to their investors, because I think they're worried about getting hammered by lawsuits or regulators later. But no, in public declarations, they're never that honest. There's something out there called the Drinking Water Research Foundation that you might check out sometime. They've got a website called the Drinking Water Research Foundation. That's not to be confused with the Water Research Foundation. The Water Research Foundation is an actual scientific research organization. There's something called the Drinking Water Research Foundation, which is a bottled water industry front that practices a lot of very questionable pseudoscience, and it's mainly a website that generates a lot of headlines about bottled water being great and echoing every time that there's a problem with the municipal water system anywhere in America. And it's a very cynical ploy. Primo is maybe the most egregious example. For a few years now, they've had a campaign that says your tap water hangs out in seedy joints. And it's got pictures of rusted pipes. And it's explicitly appealing, overtly appealing to people's fear of their tap water. You know, the other thing that we document, our study joins a raft of other empirical research that shows that the people who turn to bottled water the most are the poorest among us. Bottled water consumption is inversely correlated with income. It's this product, you know, in addition to hurting your back, it's costing you 200 times as much to drink that bottled water. Yeah, that's probably higher now thanks to inflation. But it's at least 200 times as much. But the poorest among us are the first to buy it, and it's largely because they are the least trustful of government and least trustful of the least trusting of the water system. So yeah, there's no question that distrust is central to the growth of commercial water, which is ironic because bottled water is significantly less rigorously regulated. Tap water is much more rigorously regulated than bottled water. When we have blind taste tests, most consumers can't tell the difference. And when subject to rigorous testing, bottled water fails at about the same rate or a higher rate compared to tap water. So it really is a case of an industry generating demand for a product due to perception of a quality difference that in a lot of cases simply doesn't exist.
Well, in addition to that, I mean, a lot of those bottled water companies, they're just using tap water, right? I mean, they just don't know with tap water. I'm like, okay, you're going to resell something that they're already paying for. I actually have gotten up to 5,000 times the cost per unit. And some of it,
I try to be conservative in the estimate, but it depends on what brand you're drinking.
That's usually like a convenience store or something, you know, it's expensive anyway. But still, I don't know, how frustrating. If you're in the water industry and you're thinking, we can't get rate increases to keep these systems, going and getting out of a crisis all the time. And people are spending a fortune on bottled water.
Yeah, you want to know how bad it is, Todd. There's a new product out there that's been on the shelves for a few years now that's called, and I kid you not, the product is called Liquid Death. There's a product called Liquid Death. It's water in an aluminum can, like you buy a can of soda, but the label is called Liquid Death. Right? People are choosing to buy this stuff. And it's called death. Like, that is how bad the perception of tap water is in certain parts of the community, in certain markets. So
it's like death metal or something.
Yeah.
I mean, people love that music, and it's pretty
I'm sure they're trying to go with imagery on that. But I for one, am not a consumer that will ever buy a product that is labeled death on it and then ingest it. It just seems like a poor choice.
We reserve that for rat poisoning and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So, kind of thinking a little bit about public confidence, as a former resident of Texas, and I just will note that you lived in Aggie land, but you got a burnt orange collar on. No one can see that except me. I'm not saying anything, I'm just noting that. But, Texas has had a lot of boil water notices over the last few years. I mean, were you still living here in 21 during Winter Storm Uri when all sorts of notices were, happening because of the problem with the power grid?
I had just left. I missed it by a couple months.
So people in Texas have been bombarded with these notices, and as I think they're not always serious, contamination issues or something like that. I mean, there are requirements for issuing these notices that are meant to be conservative in terms of we want to make sure it's protected. And so we have to issue them under certain circumstances where it's probably very unlikely there's anything wrong with the water, but we're trying to make sure that no one could possibly get hurt. And after a while, people see these things all the time. It can't, the way I think the system is operating, it seems to me that it's got to be undermining the public's confidence in their public water supply. And so can you talk a little bit about that whole process?
Yeah, sure. There's no question about it. There's no question that those kinds of incidents, those kinds of overt, visible, clearly experienced water problems undermine people's trust and confidence in their water systems, but then ultimately their confidence in the entire institutions of government that are supposed to keep them safe, not just the utilities, but also the regulatory regimes and the governments who are supposed to be providing those services. Look, there's some data that it actually was work that I did since we published the book, looking at people's experiences with water problems and their trust in water systems. One of the things we found is that if people had ever experienced a main break at any time in their lives, experienced a main break and then presumably without a boil water notice, they were 6% more likely to switch to bottled water. If they experienced low water pressure, that was another 6%. If they experienced dirty or cloudy water, that increased the likelihood of drinking bottled water by 9%. If people perceive their tap water to taste bad, that increases the likelihood of drinking bottled water by 14%. So all of these very tangible, immediate experiences feed people's perception of their tap water, and those perceptions are very sticky. So even if the boil water notice is a very short-term event, the change in behavior tends to be persistent, right? That people will continue to drink that bottled water in the long term.
Well, like you said earlier, people think differently about water than they do other things. And so, I mean, I can see there's that phenomenon with kind of the stickiness of water-related issues and news that really do stay with people for a long time. Kind of thinking about some more about the roots of all this, one of the things I've often wondered is, it seems like in our public discourse, sometime in the 70s or 80s, maybe, people really, saw this kind of different characterization of government starting, where government is a bad thing, or there's too much of it, or it's wasteful, or whatever. And it's become kind of a convenient way to rally people, I think. And so I've often wondered how much of that is related to some of these issues, because, we haven't talked about this yet, but anti-fluoride, that movement, when I first started working on water issues in the Edwards Aquifer in the mid-90s, some of the groups, some of the folks who organized to stop the Applewhite Reservoir, which was going to be the alternative water supply that the city of San Antonio was developing, some of those folks had kind of come from the anti-fluoride movement. And, there was a lot of discussion about, we don't want to have to drink surface water because surface water is sewage water, meaning water discharged from wastewater treatment plants is going into reservoirs. And we want to keep drinking only water coming out of the aquifer. And, I kept hearing that, and I kept thinking of Dr. Strangelove and, the purity of essence, and
our precious bodily fluids.
That's right. I'm always shocked how many people haven't seen that movie. I made my oldest daughter watch it with me recently, and she thought, okay, that's a pretty good movie. But I mean, I know I'm sounding like I'm going way out on tangent here, but But what about that kind of movement within society where, we've kind of, started thinking about government in general as a negative thing often, and how that may influence some of this, fear about drinking water that's provided.
Sure. That's a major theme of Profits of Distrust, that people's perceptions of government color their perceptions of their tap water and vice versa. Look, governments from the very beginning of the rise of civilization have built their reputations on provision of basic services, and you don't get more basic than water. You go back to the ancient Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Chinese civilizations. What were they doing? Creating water systems, right? And it's because that is the way that rulers could demonstrate their genius and their might to their populations. We see in the Roman Empire. We saw it in 18th and 19th century America, where our country built its political institutions as they were building water systems that transformed American cities from squalor to prosperity. And people could see that in a very tangible way. They could see government making their lives better through the creation of this infrastructure. I used to have to go out in the backyard or the street corner and pump water with a hand pump, and now it comes straight into my home. It's a miracle, right? People could perceive that government action making their lives better. Well, today, people have what Bayesian scholars call priors, right? They have a prior expectation that government is bad, government's incompetent, government maybe be a little bit evil, and so when I see a failure, like the Flint water crisis, it might be 1,000 miles away from where I live, but I'll look at that and I'll say, see, there you go, government failing, regulators failing, politicians failing. And especially if I'm poor, if I'm Black, I think, those people are just like me. And if the government is failing them, they're probably failing me too. One of the images that last more recently, that train derailment in East Palestine, where there was concern about drinking water quality, very well-founded concern. Former President Trump flies into town, and you notice what he does? He gives away pallets of bottled water that say Trump on them. It's Trump water. I mean, what's he doing there? He's signaling to everyone something about who you can trust and who you can't. I think this is so important because there's a lazy tendency for us to think that distrust of government is a phenomenon of the political right in America. And that is certainly true, but it's also true of the political left, right? Extremists on both ends of our ideological spectrum are distrustful of government. And they may be distrustful for different reasons, but they both distrust government. And that's why, the people to abandon tap water first oftentimes are people who we would normally associate with the political left, non-white and poor populations. Well, they're the people who distrust tap water. They maybe got different ideological reasons for that distrust, but the distrust in institutions, distrust in government, they feed into that consumer behavior. And then, of course, anytime there is a failure in those water systems, it tends to reinforce people's perceptions of those systems.
Right. I can just attest that over my career, I've gotten it from both directions. Usually not at the same time. But I've got it for both of them, and neither one's pleasant. So, what can we talk about all the problems here, but how can we counter this narrative? Is there an effective way to counter it? I mean, obviously, you're looking at the United States and the issues with our water supply system. But then you look at most nations of the world and you think, okay, the comparison is very favorable, right? Sure. Especially most large nations that have as many people as the United States. But it ends up being a lot of times, water is usually kind of bad with the story, but it really shouldn't be. How do we counter this narrative of negativity?
I'm so glad you asked that because this has been a rather dour and down conversation. And I am an optimistic guy. I think our book is ultimately hopeful. Way back at the beginning of this conversation, I told you about this vicious cycle of distrust that sets in. Well, the good news is you can flip that around, and that same vicious cycle can be virtuous. If tap water is excellent, and it's crucially, it's excellent everywhere and for everyone all the time, that's going to increase trust both in utilities, but also in the entire set of institutions that support those utilities. That's going to reduce commercial water consumption. That's going to make the pocketbook of your customer happier. It's going to make your back happier, but it's also going to give people greater personal investment in their local governments, in their state governments. It's going to make them more active citizens. It's going to make them more supportive of investments in public infrastructure. And that will, of course, give more resources and greater incentives for governments and politicians to provide excellent service. And we're back into the virtuous cycle. It's the cycle that created the trust in the first place. The whole reason people get upset about tap water failure is we had the expectation that tap water was going to be excellent and reliable everywhere. Well, when you live without that, yes, tap water seems like a miracle, right? Understandably, it's this everyday miracle of modern civilization. We haven't even talked about sanitary sewers, which might be even more impressive. Well, we think that you can solve these problems, but the solution has to start with excellence. We talk about the book of three themes: excellence, openness, and equity. And you have to have all three of those things. But excellence is the precondition. Tap water has to be excellent. It has to be excellent everywhere. It has to be excellent for everyone. One of the key important insights that we come up with in this book is that tap water distrust is contagious. That customers everywhere respond to high-profile failures like East Palestine and Jackson, Mississippi, and Flint, Michigan, and Corpus Christi, Texas. Tap water failures anywhere undermine trust everywhere. And so we have to be responsible for every system in this country. I think there's a tendency of people who run water systems to think that, look, I'm only responsible for my system. If I operate the water utility in Madison, Wisconsin, what happens even down the street is not my problem, let alone what happens to Chicago or Detroit or Dallas. Not my problem. No, it is your problem. It's all of our problems. And so we need to start seeing the entire water industry across the United States. The excellence has to be universal. That's that equity piece, right? Because people will identify with the failures that occur in other parts of the United States. So excellence, equity, and then the last one that I mentioned was openness. We need to open wide the channels of communication between customers and utilities. People need to understand these vital systems in ways that they don't always right now. And that's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of folks, right? Because it's going to mean showing how messy this stuff is. One of the fundamental disconnects about water utilities compared to almost anything else we buy is that the price of water is very visible to people, but the quality of their water systems is almost entirely invisible. One of the reasons politicians like to talk about roads and bridges when they discuss infrastructure is that they're extremely visible to people and they can experience them. If my road is in bad condition, I know it.
Right.
If my drinking water system's in bad condition, I may not know it unless it's egregiously awful, unless there's like main breaks every other week and my pressure's terrible and it's full of iron and brown stuff's coming out of my faucet. Then I know it. But otherwise, I don't know if the system is in fantastic shape or it's barely limping along. From the customer's perspective, there's this disconnect between price and quality in a way that you don't get when you buy, say, food, or when you buy a car, or you buy a lot of the other clothing. Anything else we normally buy in our lives, we can see the connection, the correlation between price and quality. That correlation is broken for water. So at the close of our book, we have a 12-point plan for reform of the water sector, and we don't have time to talk about all 12 of them. But we have reforms in mind that address excellence, openness, and equity. I'll talk just about very quickly about three of them because they connect to them. With excellence, the very clear number one, far and away most important reform we need is consolidation. We've got...
You're going to like my water market study.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Look, across the country, we don't actually even know how many water utilities there are. That's how bad it is. We don't actually even know. We know how many community water systems there are. There are about 50,000 of them. Some of those are systems, multiple systems are run by the same organization. So my best guess is that there's something like 40 to 45,000 water utilities in the United States. That's an order of magnitude larger than the entire energy sector. And everything we do in the water sector is worse because it's so fragmented.
Right.
Over half of those utilities have fewer than 5 employees. So there's only so much you can do with those little tiny systems, and it should not surprise us that they perform poorly. They're hard to regulate, and they're worst of all they're worst of all for the people who live in rural America, small town America. A lot of times these are poorer communities, working class communities, agricultural communities, and they really get left behind. So consolidation, far and away the single biggest thing we can do for excellence. For openness, one of the things I'm working on, I'm very excited, is report cards for water utilities. Report cards that would help make the performance and the quality of water systems more visible to people. You know, back in the 1990s, Congress amended the Safe Drinking Water Act to require utilities to do something called a consumer confidence report that every year was supposed to tell customers about the quality of their water. Well, that name is ironic because the empirical research on consumer confidence reports is that they make people less confident in their water, even when the water is great. And it's because they're terrible. These consumer confidence reports are very poorly designed. You feel like you have to have a PhD in chemistry to understand them. So we need to do better and put things in language and with terms that people can understand. I'm working on a set of report cards for every water utility in the state of Wisconsin that's going to put things in those tangible terms. The state of Louisiana just issued its very first report cards that are demanded by the state. Now, when you see ours come out later in Wisconsin, you're going to see that our grading standards are a little more stringent in Wisconsin than they are in Louisiana. So insert your joke about grade inflation here.
My wife's from Louisiana, so I'm not going to go there.
Well, you know, you do need to be careful. But in any case, I think these are positive moves. It's an effort to make people more aware of the quality of these systems, not just their failures. And then the last thing I'll talk about with equity is to expand the mandate of state public utilities commissions. You know, Wisconsin is one of only very few states where every water utility, both public and private, is regulated by the State Public Utilities Commission. In Wisconsin, Rhode Island, and in parts of Indiana, municipal and special district utilities are regulated by the PUCs. The rest of the country, they're not. The only investor-owned utilities are regulated by the Public Utilities Commissions. My co-authors and I believe that's a mistake. That the Wisconsin way is a better way because it provides rigorous oversight everywhere. You know, it doesn't put the onus on the poor and the disenfranchised to be their own salvation. We build regulatory oversight into investments and financial planning for all of these utilities. We think that kind of oversight should be available to everyone across the country.
Right. You know, just thinking about Texas a little bit here. So the TCEQ regulates these utilities, but rate increases go through the PUC, which has been, you know, it used to be at TCEQ, and then the legislature moved it over to PUC. And now, you know, there's been this discussion about, well, you know, they really know, PUC understands a lot more about energy than water, and maybe that's a challenge for them. But now they have two veterans who were board members of the Texas Water Development Board who are now PUC commissioners. And so I would think, well, you know, they understand water, and so that may be changing. But
even that in Texas, that's only for the investor-owned utilities.
Right.
That's not for the city of Houston or San Antonio water system, or, you know, most people in the United States, about 85% of Americans get their water service from a government. And unless you're in one of those handful of states like Wisconsin, Rhode Island, Indiana, your water rates and finances are regulated only by your city councils. And so they are not subject to any kind of oversight.
Gotcha.
There's no one looking out for necessarily looking out for the low income customer. No one necessarily scrutinizing those investments.
So TCEQ says that there's 7,100 water utilities of some kind in the state, and really a few dozen probably supply 60 to 70% of the water that's consumed in the state. I was thinking about what you were saying in the 3 points that you emphasized. And one of the issues there, obviously, is communication. Just going back to my example, from my work past, I remember that when I first started working at the River Authority, there was a mantra that if our name is not in the newspaper, we're doing a good job. And that turned out to really come back and haunt the River Authority because it had a substantial water supply in a reservoir that it had not fully tapped, and it had had it for decades. And in the interim, a lot of new people had moved in around the reservoir. And so when the River Authority decided, to sell some of that water and draw down the lake on a, maybe more frequent basis, people got very upset who had moved in around the reservoir. And many of them, their reaction was, I've never even heard of this group that's doing this. And it's because there was not any communication, really. I mean, we weren't out there communicating with our customers and other people in our district and just talking about the things that we're doing. And they had no idea about our role in managing the reservoir. They had no knowledge of any of that. And so it seems to me that what I've seen over the last 10 years at least is kind of a real not maybe renaissance is not the right word here, but there has been a real growth in the water communication industry or sector or something. With the folks that you're talking about, they're getting help more and more communicating to the public and figuring out how to reach the public and spending a lot of time trying to do that.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. And it has become a kind of a paradigm shift in the American water sector that's long overdue. I think rather than renaissance, I'd use the word awakening. There's been a kind of an awakening to the need to communicate with people. Look, if you spend 364 days of the year ignoring your wife, and then on the anniversary, you show up with some flowers and you want some affection and some attention, that's probably not going to go very well for you. And it's the same way in the water sector, right? If we ignore our customers and don't communicate with them at all until it's time for a rate increase to ask for something from them, that's not going to go well either. To mix my metaphors a little bit, I sometimes think of water and sewer systems a little bit like the offensive line on a football team, right? You only notice them when they commit a penalty, or they give up a sack, or do something else terribly. When they're doing their job well, you hardly even notice them. When they're really brilliant, you don't notice them, right? You don't notice them at all when they're doing the best possible work. Well, we need to break out of that paradigm, and it is encouraging that folks are going through that awakening now. I think the next phase is to think much more rigorously and scientifically about how to communicate effectively. And I'm very excited to tell you that Sam, David, and I, my co-authors on Profits of Distrust, we now have a proposal in with the National Science Foundation that's focused on exactly that. How do you rebuild trust through communications? Sam has done some pilot studies in Des Moines, Iowa, working with Des Moines Water Utility on different kinds of strategies. We've got a lot of utilities, a lot of professionals around the country trying a lot of things to communicate. We're not doing that very systematically and scientifically, though. There's a lot of people throwing a lot of spaghetti against the wall. But if we want to be effective, we need to move this from being a craft to more of a science. I've been involved, and it's probably a good topic for another podcast, but I've been involved with a couple of really interesting studies on what kinds of messages work effectively, what kind of media work effectively in communicating with customers, because it turns out some things work better than others. And we need to build up the body of knowledge, just like we do with water treatment. We don't design water treatment systems by trial and error. We use and feel and gut and intuition. We use science, right? And we need to take the same approach for water communications. I think it's encouraging that we're beginning to see some work in that direction. Hopefully, in a couple of years, I can come back and tell you about our path-breaking research on different ways to communicate.
We will book that. We will do that. So I want to start to wrap up here and just kind of get your thoughts on, something that I've been thinking about, how, a few years ago, if you were talking about water infrastructure, that was an obscure topic and, it might be on the back page of the newspaper or something. And today, gosh, it's front and center. And especially in Texas, there's so much discussion and thought about water infrastructure now as compared to in the past. And of course, that's very encouraging to me. And I'm just wondering, what if we can keep that up? Is this just going to be a phase, and then people are going to move on to something else again in a few years, or could this maybe be something that is kind of a permanent change? Spending more time thinking about what and all it requires to get it from where you find it to where people need it.
There's a great scholar, economist and political scientist named Anthony Downs, who once observed that you should never underestimate the capacity of the American public to become bored. So, and he was writing that 50 years ago. So we can only think about how much shorter our attention spans have gotten, how much faster the news cycle works now. Look, whether this is a movement or a moment is kind of to put succinctly, kind of the questions you asked. I think that's going to depend on the extent to which we make institutional reforms. I've been greatly encouraged over the last few years about how much more attention the water sector's had from policymakers at the highest levels of state and federal government. I think we started to see that late in the Trump presidency. It's accelerated tremendously in the Biden presidency. But what I have seen mostly is commitments by politicians to spend a lot of money. What I have not seen is an accompanying commitment to changing the institutional structures that govern and provide water.
Right.
And without those fundamental reforms, let me back it up for a second. My great hope is that all of that largesse and all of that attention will be a transformative moment for the American water sector that we haven't seen really since the passage of the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act 50 years ago. That's the great hope. The great fear is that all that largesse will just be new wine into old wineskins, and that our children and grandchildren will be sitting here in 50 years saying, why are our water systems all failing? Because we haven't fixed the underlying institutions. Pouring more money into failed institutions doesn't fix that institution. And if it doesn't fix the institutions, and if we're not careful, we can make things worse, Todd. And I know we're wrapping up, so I'll close on this point. If we know that a fundamental challenge in Texas and across the country is that our water systems are fragmented, we have way too many of these little failing water systems all over the place. And so we channel a bunch of federal and state money into those systems. That's going to help those systems today, but it doesn't necessarily put them on a path to sustainability. Indeed, almost by definition, they are unsustainable. And one of the things I spend a lot of time worrying about is that if we set up our funding formula so that being small and being in poor condition puts you in a better position to get external money, we have accidentally created a terrible moral hazard here. right? We've accidentally given people an incentive to run unsustainable systems. So we got to be really, really careful about how we structure and incentivize the development of these systems going forward.
You sound like a long-suffering NFL fan whose team is never good, but they decided, we're going to tank this year because this guy who's coming out in the draft next year, we want to get that person. And so,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I really have enjoyed our discussion, and I think, for Texas, kind of the issue is you always hear this mantra about local control, and, it seems like the legislature is interested in local control until it's not.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
And so that's kind of the thing that I think we have to overcome here is what we really would benefit from is more regional, not control, but regional cooperation is how I'd put it, and find incentives for these systems to regionalize and have partners to work together and create more resilient systems. And so that's what I'm, hanging my hat on is that what's going on now with this focus on water infrastructure and the additional funds that are going to be made available will end up helping to encourage more regionalization.
One of the things I love about Texas, I've always loved about Texas, there's a strong tradition of pragmatism. I mean, get past the hot button issues of the moment. Texas government has usually been about what works.
Right.
And in that sense, I've been a big fan of the River Basin authorities. I think it's a very smart way to organize government. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would put all of the water systems in Texas, all the drinking and water and sewer systems under the governance of those institutions, because that's adapting our governance institutions to the natural systems that God gave us, rather than trying to shoehorn our own government institutions into these hydrological systems that were never meant to work that way. So, I think that's a wonderful thing. Like, look, the Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution is the right to local self-government. And I think that's a beautiful thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean my little tiny town has to be in charge of everything, right? It just means giving people a voice and a stake in their own governance. And that's a proud Texas tradition that I'd like to see carry forward.
Well, I hope that you're spreading that word up there in Wisconsin around a little bit. I hope there's a receptive audience for that. And I just want to thank you for coming on and talking about Profits of Distrust and all these other water-related issues today. I mean, I really enjoyed this and glad we were able to get it arranged. And after you finish your next study there, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that you get your NSF funding. I'd love to come here, how we can better communicate with people about their water utilities.
Well, I'll look forward to that, Todd. It's been great chatting with you.
All right. Well, thanks, Manny. Oh, and how can people find out more about what you're doing? Let me make sure I get this in.
Yeah, of course. Let me start with this. If you want to pick up The Profits of Distrust, it's available from any bookseller, directly from Cambridge University Press, or of course you can get it from Amazon. To follow me in my work more generally, you can find me at mannyteodoro.com. That's MannyTeodoro.com. I blog very frequently, and you can find most of my published research right there on my website.
Great. Thanks, Manny. We'll put a link to your website when we post this in Texas+Water later this month. So people will be able to find your website that way as well. All right. Well, this has been Talk+Water. My guest today was Professor Manny Teodoro. Manny is professor at the Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and one of the authors of the 2022 book, The Profits of Distrust. I also want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. Finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk+Water ready to flow. My name is Todd Votteler. Let's talk water again soon.